We have arrived at a very interesting time in the world at the moment. The pandemic of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, that is spread now around all countries of the world, means that business as usual, the conventional way of acting, no longer works. And in fact, the conventional way of business as usual, if we were to continue to do what we've been doing over the last 50 years, it would spread the disease and millions of people would die. So given this crisis, given this economic crisis, given this medical crisis, given this social crisis, what we find is we need to do something different. We now need to act in a different way if we're not going to make things worse. And what we see is this is a time in which ecological integrity is being challenged. It's been shown, for instance, that the ecological crisis that we've been facing of clearing of rainforests has led to the coronavirus. It's been bringing native species close to human beings. And so we have what they call a zoonotic infection. It's an infection that's passed from bats to pangolins to human beings because these species are being brought into contact. And so we need to act differently if we're going to overcome this crisis. And faced with this crisis, we have three different groups of people. The first group of people are people who've been preparing for social and political and economic change for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. Since the publication of the book Limits to Growth in 1972, people have been known that we cannot keep growing in the same way because it destroys the environment, and we are facing the sixth biggest extinction of life in the whole 530 million years in which life has existed. There are 15 species an hour that are becoming extinct, and this is faster than the extinction that when the dinosaurs disappeared on the planet. So we need to change. And people like Greta Thunberg in Sweden, who mobilized 140 million people all around the world, young people, to protest against climate change, has been showing that this way of acting is no longer sustainable. The second thing is that the polarization between rich and poor on the planet cannot continue the way in which it is. There are 8 men who between them have a wealth equal to 50% of the world's population, and that cannot continue. And so that type of business as usual cannot continue because it just polarizes the gap between rich and poor. The third kind of danger that cannot continue is that we have built an economy that is dependent upon compulsive consumption, that the way in which people achieve their self-awareness, achieve their self-worth, is by consuming more. And the more you consume, the higher status you have. And that cannot continue. So given these, what we find is that the first group of people are aware of these kinds of things. The second group of people that we need to focus upon are people who are aware that business as usual cannot continue, but they have no idea on what kind of change needs to happen. They have no idea that we can build a community that is not dependent on economic growth. They have no idea that we can regenerate economies, but they know that something has to change. And this is a big and a growing segment of the population. The third group of people are people who feel the fear and the pain of the loss of business as usual. They are terrified of what is happening as a result of coronavirus. They're really frightened of the future. And so we have these three groups of people. And so if you are a person who is alive at the moment, what do you need to do? You need to build alliances with the first two groups of people. And you need to be able to communicate with the third group of people to minimize their fear. Because what happens when people are fearful, they react with violence. And if they react with violence, that just makes the situation worse. So what we need to do is look at a new type of leadership. It's a kind of leadership that we haven't seen very much before. At the moment, most leaders are very good at giving instructions, telling people what they ought to do. But we need to focus on the other two characteristics of leadership. Good leadership is about good communication. And good communication depends upon two other things. One is about empathy, reaching out to those people who need to feel support. You know, the New Zealand Prime Minister received a letter from a small girl who said, "Does lockdown mean that we don't get the Easter Bunny this year?" And so what the New Zealand Prime Minister did, she sent around the whole of New Zealand pictures of Easter eggs. And she said, "Please colour these pictures in and put them in the window of your house so children can still go looking for Easter eggs." That is empathy. You know, the New Zealand Prime Minister had a terrorist attack in which people went in and shot up a mosque in New Zealand. And the way in which she reached out to the people was an example of the kind of leadership we need today. But empathy is only one part of this. The second part that is equally important is giving meaning. People at the moment, we are an animal that creates meaning. And there's so much fake news, so much conspiracy theories going around about the coronavirus at the moment. We need to be told the best information available. We need to learn from the best science and the best doctors and the best hospitals about the best way to limit the effects of this disease. And so that's a second kind of leadership that's needed, a leadership that builds meaning. And then the third kind of leadership is, how do we get people, activists in all countries of the world, to reach out across their countries and build systems of meaning that help and support themselves to make the difference. Pope Francis has just declared, as a result of the coronavirus, if we're going to limit the coronavirus, what we need to do. What do we need to do? We need to build an economic system that guarantees a minimum income for every single person alive in a country. A minimum income that helps them meet their needs for food, clothing, shelter, housing, medical care, education. And this system of guaranteed minimum income has been talked about for years. It has been talked about by scientists who are interested in automation, because with automation, we can produce all the goods and services we need with no one working. And that's been a big problem, because in the last 50 years, the system of income distribution is dependent upon how productive you are in the economy. And what we're finding at the moment with the shutdowns is goods and services are still being produced by people working at home. We need to find ways, like the progressive countries of the world have been doing, of providing a minimum income so that people get their needs met. Because if people don't get their needs met, then they're not going to be prepared to stay at home and lock down. They're not going to be able to cut off and self-quarantine. They're going to not be able to limit the spread of this disease. And if they can't limit the spread of this disease, millions and millions of people around this world are going to die. We're going to see the biggest death on this planet, bigger than World War II, bigger than World War I. And it's happening because we need to make the changes that are necessary for this type of situation in which we're in. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Great Turning. We've been talking about the Great Turning for 10, 15 years through Dragon Dreaming. The Great Turning is upon us now. We need to start living with kindness to each other, with support for each other, with generosity for each other, and building the kind of social links that will enable us to make these changes. We need to be effective in collective intelligence to put pressure on our governments to make the changes necessary. because without doing this, the situation is going to be very, very bad. So welcome to the most exciting time in history. We've spoken about this before, and it's here and it's now. Thank you.